The city that would become the wonder of the ancient world was, in the early decades of the 7th century before Christ, a place of wounded pride and quiet endurance. Babylon had once ruled Mesopotamia, had once been the seat of Hammurabi's laws and Marduk's worship, but generations of Assyrian dominance had reduced it to a provincial capital whose glory existed more in memory than in present reality. The great temples still stood. The Euphrates still flowed through the heart of the city. Priests still performed the rituals that connected earth to heaven. But true power resided far to the north, in Nineveh, where Assyrian kings commanded armies that had crushed every challenger for 3 centuries. Into this Babylon of diminished circumstances but undiminished ambition, sometime around 634 BC, a child was born who would restore everything his city had lost. The boy received the name Nabu-kudurri-usur, Nebuchadnezzar, in the form that later traditions would preserve, a name invoking the god Nabu, patron of wisdom and writing, asking divine protection for the heir who would continue his father's line. That father, Nabopolassar, was a Chaldean chieftain from the southern marshlands who had seized opportunity when Assyrian weakness provided it. In 626 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar was still a child, Nabopolassar claimed the throne of Babylon, declared independence from Assyrian overlordship, and began the military campaigns that would transform rebellion into empire. The Neo-Babylonian dynasty had begun, and the child growing up in its palaces would become its greatest representative. The education that a crown prince required filled the years of Nebuchadnezzar's youth, with studies whose mastery would serve him throughout his reign. Cuneiform literacy allowed him to read and compose the inscriptions that kings used to commemorate their achievements, a skill the thousands of building texts he would eventually produce demonstrated he had learned well. Mathematics enabled the architectural calculations that would later transform Babylon's landscape. Astronomy, which Babylonian scholars had developed to sophistication unmatched elsewhere in the ancient world, taught him to read the celestial patterns whose meanings affected royal decisions. Military training along the riverbanks prepared him for the campaigns he would soon join, developing the patience and organizational skill that would characterize his command. The war against Assyria that formed the backdrop of this education was not Babylon's struggle alone. Nabopolassar had secured an alliance with the Medes, the Iranian people whose king, Cyaxares, harbored ambitions that Assyrian weakness made achievable. The coalition combined Babylonian resources with Median military power, their partnership proving more than Assyria's diminished strength could withstand. The marriage that united Nebuchadnezzar to Amytis, a Median princess, cemented this alliance through bonds that mere treaties could not secure. Amytis would become Nebuchadnezzar's queen, her presence in Babylon later inspiring legends about gardens built to ease her longing for the green mountains of her homeland. The climax of the anti-Assyrian war came in 612 BC, when the combined forces of Babylon and Media descended upon Nineveh itself. Nebuchadnezzar, now in his early 20s, likely participated in the campaign, whose success would eliminate the power that had dominated Mesopotamia for centuries. The siege lasted 3 months before the city fell, its end hastened by flooding that breached the walls. The king of Assyria died in the destruction, the palace burning around him as the empire his predecessors had built collapsed into ruin. Assyrian remnants retreated westward to Haran, where they attempted to maintain a state that had lost its capital and most of its territory. Egyptian forces under Pharaoh Necho II marched north to support these survivors, Egypt preferring a weakened Assyria as a buffer against Babylonian power. But Haran fell in 610 BC, the last stronghold overcome. the empire that had terrorized the ancient Near East finally extinguished. The world that Nebuchadnezzar had been born into, a world dominated by Assyrian power, had ceased to exist. The young prince now stood at his father's side, as Babylon assumed the position that Assyria's destruction had vacated. The Levant, the crucial region connecting Mesopotamia to Egypt and providing access to Mediterranean trade, became the arena where Babylonian and Egyptian interests would compete. Nebuchadnezzar accompanied his father on campaigns into Syria during the years following Nineveh's fall, his experience of command developing through operations whose importance his education had prepared him to understand. The logistics of moving armies across deserts, the diplomacy required to secure lasting submissions, the judgment needed to distinguish resistance requiring suppression from accommodation, deserving acceptance. These skills accumulated through years that prepared him for the independent command he would soon assume. By 605 BC, Nabopolassar's health had declined to the point where active campaigning was no longer possible for the aging king. The confrontation with Egypt that the struggle for the Levant had made inevitable would fall to the crown prince, now a man in his early 30s, whose decades of preparation were about to face their definitive test. The army that Nebuchadnezzar led northward toward the Euphrates carried with it the future of Babylonian power, and the prince who commanded it was about to become a king. The Euphrates marked the boundary between worlds. Behind lay Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers that Babylon now dominated. Ahead lay Syria and the Levant, territories whose control would determine whether the empire Nabopolassar had founded would rival the Assyrian dominion it had replaced, or remain a regional power confined to its riverine heartland. At Carchemish, where the great river could be crossed and where trade routes converged from every direction, an Egyptian army under Pharaoh Necho II had established itself, their presence announcing Egypt's intention to fill the vacuum that Assyria's collapse had created. The confrontation that the past decade had been building toward would be settled here. In the late spring of 605 BC, and the prince who led Babylon's forces understood that everything depended on what the next days would bring. The Egyptian army that Nebuchadnezzar faced was no negligible force. Necho had committed substantial resources to his northern strategy. His troops, including not only Egyptian regulars, but Greek mercenaries, whose heavy infantry tactics had proven effective across the Mediterranean world. The position at Carchemish offered defensive advantages that a competent commander could exploit, the river protecting flanks and the city providing a fortified base from which operations could proceed. The Egyptians had reason to believe they could hold what they had claimed, their confidence rooted in military traditions that stretched back millennia, and in recent successes that had carried them this far north. What followed demonstrated that Nebuchadnezzar had absorbed the lessons his years of preparation had provided. The Babylonian assault on Carchemish combined the weight of Mesopotamian military tradition with tactical flexibility that Egyptian expectations had not anticipated. The battle was decisive. Egyptian forces broke under pressure they could not sustain, their retreat becoming a rout as Babylonian pursuit prevented any reorganization. The army that had represented Egypt's bid for Levantine hegemony ceased to exist as an effective force, its survivors fleeing southward while Nebuchadnezzar's troops followed to ensure the destruction was complete. The pursuit carried the Babylonians to Hamath, deep in Syrian territory, where the remnants of Egyptian strength were scattered beyond recovery. The chroniclers who recorded these events in the Babylonian chronicles, the cuneiform tablets that documented royal achievements year by year, noted that Nebuchadnezzar conquered the entire region. Egyptian resistance eliminated so thoroughly that Necho would never again attempt northern expansion on this scale. The Levant, from the Euphrates to the borders of Egypt itself, lay open to Babylonian authority. The prince who had marched north seeking battle returned as the dominant power in the Western territories, his victory transforming the political geography of the ancient Near East. But the triumph at Carchemish was interrupted by news that required immediate response. Messengers reached the Babylonian camp, bearing word that Nabopolassar had died in Babylon on the 15th day of the month of Abu, mid-August by later reckonings. The king who had founded the dynasty, who had led the revolt against Assyria and forged the alliance that destroyed Nineveh, was gone. The throne stood vacant, and every day it remained so invited, the complications that interregnums produced. Rival claimants, provincial governors calculating their options, neighboring powers assessing whether the transition might be exploited. Nebuchadnezzar's response revealed the decisiveness that would characterize his reign. Leaving his army to secure the conquests that Carchemish had achieved, he assembled a small escort and set out across the desert that separated Syria from Babylon. The direct route, bypassing the slower path along the Euphrates, demanded speed that only a small party traveling light could maintain. The journey that would normally require weeks of careful progress through difficult terrain, Nebuchadnezzar completed in 23 days, his urgency compressing distance through sheer determination to reach the capital before uncertainty could fester into crisis. He arrived in Babylon to find the situation stable. The administrative structures his father had built held firm, the officials who managed the empire's affairs continuing their functions, the potential for disorder contained by institutions whose reliability this first test confirmed. The transition that might have invited chaos, instead, proceeded with a smoothness that testified to Nabopolassar's success in creating systems capable of surviving their creator. The sun, who had raced across the desert, found a throne waiting for him, rather than a succession struggle demanding resolution. The coronation that formalized Nebuchadnezzar's assumption of power took place on the 7th day of the month of Ululu, early September of 605 BC, less than a month after his father's death. The ceremonies unfolded in the sacred precincts of Babylon, where the temples of Marduk and the other great gods provided settings whose sanctity transformed political transition into cosmic affirmation. The priests of Esagila, the great temple complex dedicated to Marduk, conducted rituals whose forms tradition had established and whose performance conferred legitimacy that mere inheritance could not provide. The new king clasped the hands of Marduk's statue in the ceremony that Babylonian tradition required, the physical contact symbolizing the relationship between deity and ruler that proper kingship embodied. Incense rose in the sacred chambers, its fragrance carrying prayers toward the heavens whose favor the rituals sought to secure. The titles that generations of Babylonian kings had borne now passed to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the 4 quarters of the world. The prince who had departed months earlier to fight Egypt returned as sovereign of an empire whose expansion his own victory had ensured. The kingdom Nebuchadnezzar inherited was larger than the one his father had ruled at the start of that fateful year. The Levantine territories that Carchemish had opened now required integration into Babylonian systems, governors to be appointed, tribute to be assessed, arrangements to be established that would transform military conquest into stable administration. Egypt remained a power whose interests conflicted with Babylonian ambitions, its defeat at Carchemish decisive but not final, its resources sufficient to support future challenges if opportunities arose. The empire demanded attention from a king whose reign was measured in weeks, whose authority was established but not yet proven through the sustained achievement that legitimacy ultimately required. Nebuchadnezzar was 30 years old, perhaps slightly less, when he assumed the throne that 43 years of rule still lay before him. The victories were only beginning, the building projects not yet imagined, the city whose splendor would astonish the ancient world still wearing the modest face of a capital, whose greatness remained potential rather than actual. The young king, who had proven himself in battle, would now discover what proving himself in peace demanded, and the transformation he would work upon Babylon would exceed anything that military triumph alone could achieve. The proof came quickly, for an empire at the height of expansion allowed its rulers no respite. Within months of his coronation, Nebuchadnezzar marched again, westward into the Levant, where the victory at Carchemish required consolidation through the visible presence of royal power. The kingdoms that lined the Mediterranean coast had learned of Egypt's defeat, had calculated the implications of Babylonian supremacy, and now faced choices whose consequences would shape their futures for generations. Some submitted readily, their tribute and pledges of loyalty purchasing security that resistance could not provide. Others hesitated, weighing their options, watching to see whether this new king possessed the resolve to enforce the authority his armies had claimed. The city-states of Phoenicia, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos recognized the shifting winds and offered submission that their commercial interests made prudent. These maritime peoples, whose ships connected the Mediterranean world, cared less about which empire claimed sovereignty than about stability that allowed trade to flourish. Babylonian authority, if exercised with the restraint that profitable commerce required, was acceptable. The kingdoms further south proved more complicated, their positions between Babylon and Egypt making neutrality difficult and alignment dangerous, regardless of which direction it took. Judah, the small kingdom centered on Jerusalem, whose significance would far exceed its modest territorial extent, exemplified the dilemmas that Levantine states confronted. King Jehoiakim, who had been installed by Pharaoh Necho during Egypt's brief period of regional dominance, initially transferred his allegiance to Babylon as Carchemish demanded. For 3 years, tribute flowed from Jerusalem to the Babylonian treasury, the relationship between great king and vassal proceeding according to the patterns that imperial governance established. But Egypt had not abandoned its interests in the region, and Egyptian diplomacy worked to encourage the defections that might weaken Babylonian control. The test of Nebuchadnezzar's supremacy came in 601 BC, when he marched against Egypt itself, seeking to settle the rivalry that Carchemish had decided but not concluded. The campaign that followed proved less decisive than the victory 6 years earlier. The Babylonian chronicles record that both sides suffered heavy losses, the engagement ending without the clear outcome that previous battles had produced. Nebuchadnezzar withdrew to Babylon, his army requiring time to recover from casualties that a full campaigning season could not immediately replace. The setback was temporary, but it was real, and those watching for signs of weakness believed they had found one. Jehoiakim chose this moment to withhold tribute, his rebellion calculated on the assumption that Babylonian power had crested and that Egypt might yet prove the stronger patron. The calculation proved fatally mistaken. Nebuchadnezzar's response was patient but inexorable. While his main forces rebuilt, he dispatched Babylonian garrisons supplemented by troops from loyal vassal states to harass Judah, the pressure constant even if a full siege was not yet possible. Jehoiakim died in 598 BC, the circumstances unclear, his son Jehoiakim inheriting a throne whose occupant faced a reckoning that rebellion had made inevitable. The reckoning arrived in 597 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar personally led his army to Jerusalem. The siege was brief, The city's defenses could not withstand the force arrayed against them, and Jehoiakim, who had reigned only 3 months, chose surrender over destruction. The young king was taken captive, transported to Babylon along with his family, his court, and thousands of Judah's skilled workers and leading citizens. This first deportation removed the people whose abilities might enable future resistance, their exile serving both punitive and practical purposes. The treasures of Jerusalem's temple and palace accompanied the captives eastward, wealth accumulated over generations now flowing to Babylonian treasuries. In Jehoiakim's place, Nebuchadnezzar installed Zedekiah, another member of the Davidic line whose elevation came with expectations of loyalty that his predecessor had failed to meet. The arrangement was typical of imperial practice. Local rulers remained in place, their authority derived from Babylonian appointment, their continued tenure contingent on behavior that served Babylonian interests. Judah would have another decade of nominal independence under this arrangement, a decade during which the wisdom of submission and the folly of resistance would be tested once more. The Babylonian chronicles that recorded these campaigns, cuneiform tablets whose matter-of-fact entries documented royal achievements with bureaucratic precision, preserved a record of activity that filled the early years of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Campaigns against Arab tribes in 599 BC secured the desert flanks that protected routes connecting Babylon to its western territories. Operations in the mountain regions northeast of Mesopotamia maintained the security that trade with distant lands required. Year after year, the tablets recorded marches and submissions, tribute received and order maintained. The rhythm of imperial governance proceeding with regularity that bespoke effective administration. Yet military campaigns, however successful, represented only part of what Nebuchadnezzar was building. Even during these years of frequent warfare, attention turned increasingly toward the transformation of Babylon itself into a capital worthy of the empire it commanded. The construction projects that would eventually make the city legendary began modestly, repairs to temples whose maintenance previous generations had neglected, improvements to fortifications whose strength the uncertain early years made prudent, investments in the canals whose waters sustained agriculture and enabled the commerce upon which urban prosperity depended. The walls that protected Babylon received particular attention. Their circuits extended and strengthened until the city's defenses became famous throughout the ancient world. The inner wall, called Imgur Enlil, rose to heights that impressed visitors accustomed to more modest fortifications. The outer wall, Nemeti Enlil, added depth to defenses that siege warfare of the era could not easily overcome. The moat that surrounded both walls, fed by waters diverted from the Euphrates, completed a defensive system whose scale announced that this city expected to endure. Within these walls, the urban fabric began its transformation. Streets were straightened and paved with stones whose inscriptions identified the king who had ordered their placement. The great processional way that would eventually connect the city's gates to its sacred center started taking shape, its path prepared for the ceremonies that would later make it famous. The temples, whose worship anchored Babylonian religious life, received contributions that restored their splendor and announced royal piety. The program of building that would occupy decades had begun, its outlines visible so even as wars continued to demand attention and resources. Nebuchadnezzar was creating something unprecedented, an empire whose power expressed itself not only through military dominance, but through cultural magnificence that subject peoples could not help but acknowledge. The king who commanded armies also commanded artisans, scribes, and architects, whose skills would transform Babylon from a recovered capital into a wonder of the ancient world. The foundations were being laid, literally and figuratively, for achievements whose full realization still lay years ahead. The achievements that those years would bring exceeded even what the ambitious king had envisioned, though their realization was not uninterrupted. The Levant, whose submission had seemed secure after Jerusalem's humiliation in 597 BC, stirred again with the restlessness that Egyptian diplomacy encouraged and distance from Babylon enabled. Zedekiah, the king, whom Nebuchadnezzar had installed to govern a chastened Judah, began entertaining the same calculations that had destroyed his predecessor. Perhaps Egypt would intervene. Perhaps Babylon was overextended. Perhaps rebellion might succeed, where submission offered only diminished sovereignty. The calculations were no wiser the second time than they had been the first. The siege of Jerusalem began in 588 BC, Babylonian forces encircling the city, whose walls Zedekiah believed might hold until Egyptian rescue arrived. The siege lasted 2.5 years, the population within enduring privations that desperation prolonged but could not indefinitely sustain. An Egyptian army did march north, and for a moment hope flickered in Jerusalem as Babylonian forces withdrew to meet this new threat. But the confrontation produced Egyptian retreat rather than Babylonian defeat, and the siege resumed with the certainty that no relief would come. The city fell in the summer of 586 BC. Its walls breached, its defenders exhausted, its king captured while attempting to flee. The destruction that followed surpassed what the first siege had inflicted. The temple that Solomon had built centuries earlier, the sacred center of Judean worship, whose treasures had already been diminished by the earlier deportation, was systematically dismantled and burned. The palace and the principal buildings of the city suffered the same fate. The walls that had prolonged resistance were torn down, their stones scattered to prevent the fortifications from ever again sheltering rebellion. A second deportation carried more of the population eastward to Babylon, their exile joining that of those taken a decade earlier in what later tradition would remember as the Babylonian captivity. Nebuchadnezzar turned next to Tyre, the island city whose position offshore had allowed it to resist conquests that mainland cities could not escape. The siege that began in 585 BC would last 13 years, the Babylonian army maintaining positions on the coast, while the Tyrians supplied themselves by sea and waited for the patience of their besiegers to exhaust itself. The patience did not exhaust. Year after year, Nebuchadnezzar maintained the investment, the commitment of resources demonstrating that resistance to Babylonian authority would be answered with persistence that matched whatever endurance the resistors could muster. Tyre eventually came to terms in 573 BC, its submission negotiated rather than compelled by assault, its commercial activities continuing under arrangements that acknowledged Babylonian supremacy. The inscriptions that Nebuchadnezzar carved into cliff faces in Lebanon during these years, at Wadi Brisa and Nahr el-Kalb, where previous conquerors had left their own marks, commemorated achievements whose permanence the stone itself was meant to guarantee. The texts announced his victories and his piety, his service to the gods, and his transformation of Babylon into a city worthy of their worship. The cedar forests of Lebanon, whose timber had supplied building projects throughout the ancient Near East for millennia, now sent their logs to Babylon, where construction on a scale unprecedented in Mesopotamian history demanded materials that only these mountains could provide. For even as armies besieged distant cities, the transformation of Babylon continued. The projects that had begun modestly in the early years of the reign now expanded into undertakings whose ambition matched the resources that empire provided. The Ishtar Gate, rising at the northern entrance to the city, where the processional way began its course toward the sacred precinct, took shape as artisans assembled the glazed bricks whose colors would make it famous. Deep blue backgrounds against which golden lions and dragons processed in raised relief, their forms repeated in patterns whose regularity announced the order that divine favor and royal power maintained. The processional way itself received its final form during these years, the street paved with limestone slabs, whose inscriptions identified Nebuchadnezzar as the king who had laid them for Marduk, his lord. The walls that lined this sacred avenue bore glazed brick lions, their images striding alongside the processions that festival days would bring. The statue of Marduk carried through streets whose decoration proclaimed the god's glory and the king's devotion. The experience of walking this route, surrounded by images whose colors gleamed in the Mesopotamian sun, impressed visitors with magnificence that deliberate design had calculated to produce. The great ziggurat of Babylon, Etemenanki, the temple whose name meant house of the foundation of heaven and earth, rose renewed under Nebuchadnezzar's attention. This step tower, whose profile dominated the city's skyline, had existed in earlier forms before time, and neglect had diminished it. Nebuchadnezzar restored and expanded the structure until it reached heights that later tradition would associate with the Tower of Babel, its summit bearing a temple where rituals connected earth to heaven, and where the priests of Marduk performed rites whose sanctity the architecture itself proclaimed. The ziggurat became a symbol of Babylon itself, its image appearing on boundary stones and cylinder seals, its reality impressing all who beheld it with the power and piety of the king who had raised it. The palaces from which Nebuchadnezzar governed matched the temples in which he worshipped. The southern palace, the principal royal residence whose throne room received ambassadors and suppliants from across the known world, expanded through construction that added courtyards, chambers, and defensive works. The northern palace, sometimes called the Summer Palace, provided retreat from the heat that Mesopotamian summers brought, its location allowing breezes that the southern palace's density impeded. The administrative complex that governed an empire occupied quarters whose scale reflected the bureaucratic sophistication that effective rule required. It was in connection with these palaces that later tradition would place the hanging gardens, the terraced plantings that Greek writers would eventually count among the wonders of the world. The accounts that preserved this legend attributed the gardens to Nebuchadnezzar's desire to please his wife Amytis, who missed the green mountains of her Median homeland amid Babylon's flat riverine landscape. Whether such gardens existed in the form that legend described, terraces rising like artificial hills, planted with trees and flowers, irrigated by machinery that lifted water from the river below, archaeology has not confirmed. But the legend itself testified to Nebuchadnezzar's reputation as a builder whose achievements inspired wonder that later generations felt compelled to embellish. What archaeology has confirmed is extensive enough. The bricks that excavators recovered by the thousands bore stamps identifying Nebuchadnezzar as the king who had ordered their manufacture. The inscriptions repeated across millions of individual units that construction had required. "I am Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon," these stamps announced. The formula's repetition ensuring that whoever encountered these bricks, even centuries later, when the buildings they composed had fallen, would know whose will had raised them. The king built not merely for his own time, but for posterity, his name pressed into clay that would preserve it long after the flesh that bore that name had returned to dust. The Euphrates itself received attention that demonstrated engineering capabilities, whose sophistication matched the architectural achievements visible above ground. A bridge connected the city's two halves. its construction enabling traffic to cross the river without depending on boats whose capacity limited the volume of movement that urban life required. The river's course through the city was managed through quay walls and embankments whose maintenance prevented the flooding that uncontrolled waters would have caused. The canals that distributed water throughout Babylon and the surrounding agricultural lands received improvements that increased the productivity upon which urban population depended. By 570 BC, the city that Nebuchadnezzar had been transforming for 3 decades had become the greatest metropolis the ancient world had known. Its walls enclosed an area that no other city could match. Its temples rose in splendor that honored gods whose favor the king believed he had earned. Its palaces housed an administration whose reach extended from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. The vision that had guided this transformation, a city reflecting cosmic order, its beauty proclaiming the righteousness of the rule that created it, had achieved physical form that visitors could behold and inhabitants could experience in their daily lives. The king who had built this city now governed it with the same attention to detail that construction had required. The decades of warfare and building had produced an empire whose administration demanded systems sophisticated enough to manage diversity across territories stretching from the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia to the shores of the Mediterranean. Nebuchadnezzar had proven himself as conqueror and architect. The final years of his reign would demonstrate his capabilities as administrator, the least celebrated but perhaps most essential of the roles that effective kingship required. The bureaucracy that managed Babylonian affairs operated through hierarchies whose efficiency the empire's survival required. Provincial governors administered territories according to principles that balanced local custom against imperial demand. Their authority derived from royal appointment and maintained through regular accounting to the center. The shatamu, temple administrators whose responsibilities encompassed both religious and economic functions, managed the vast estates that supported Babylon's sanctuaries and the priests who served them. Scribes recorded everything: harvests and tributes, legal judgments and commercial transactions, astronomical observations and royal proclamations, their cuneiform tablets accumulating in archives whose contents preserved the empire's memory. Trade flourished under the stability that Nebuchadnezzar's power guaranteed. Caravans crossed the deserts connecting Babylon to Arabia. Their cargoes, including the incense and spices that religious rituals required and wealthy households desired. Ships navigated the Persian Gulf, linking Mesopotamian markets to the commerce of distant lands whose products, copper, precious stones, exotic woods, found their way to Babylonian workshops. The Phoenician cities, whose submission the early campaigns had secured, provided access to Mediterranean networks whose reach extended to Egypt, Greece, and beyond. The wealth that this commerce generated supported the construction projects that continued even after the major works had been completed. The revenues of empire funding, maintenance, and refinement of what earlier decades had built. The unfinished business with Egypt that the inconclusive campaign of 601 BC had left lingering received attention in 568 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar launched another invasion against the ancient kingdom of the Nile. Pharaoh Amasis, who had seized the Egyptian throne through upheaval that suggested internal weakness Babylon might exploit, faced a Babylonian army whose intentions the fragmentary records do not fully clarify. The campaign achieved some measure of success. Later sources indicate that Babylonian forces penetrated Egyptian territory, though the results fell short of the conquest that complete victory would have represented. Egypt remained independent, its sovereignty preserved by distances and resources that even Nebuchadnezzar's power could not overcome. but its capacity to challenge Babylonian supremacy in the Levant had been eliminated. The rivalry that had defined the region's politics since Carchemish ended not with one side's destruction, but with boundaries that both powers accepted. The stability that these arrangements provided allowed Nebuchadnezzar to focus increasingly on the spiritual dimensions of kingship that Mesopotamian tradition emphasized. The temples whose restoration had occupied so much of his building program were not merely monuments to royal vanity, but functioning centers of worship whose rituals sustained the cosmic order that proper rule maintained. The king's relationship with Marduk, the god whose supremacy Babylonian theology proclaimed, required constant attention. Offerings and prayers, participation in festivals, maintenance of the sanctuaries where divine presence dwelt. The Great New Year Festival, celebrated each spring when the agricultural cycle renewed itself and the world's order was ritually reaffirmed, brought the king to Esagila for ceremonies whose performance his presence legitimized. For 11 days the rituals proceeded, prayers and processions, the recitation of creation myths, the symbolic humiliation and restoration of the king that reminded even the most powerful ruler of his subordination to divine authority. Nebuchadnezzar clasped the hands of Marduk's statue as he had at his coronation decades earlier, the gesture renewing the bond between God and king that Babylonian ideology held essential to proper governance. These were not empty formalities, but expressions of conviction that the inscriptions Nebuchadnezzar left behind consistently reflected. Those inscriptions, composed in the formal language that royal texts employed, reveal a ruler whose self-understanding centered on piety rather than conquest. Where Assyrian kings had boasted of enemies slain and cities destroyed, Nebuchadnezzar's texts emphasized temples restored and gods honored. I am Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the pious prince, appointed by the will of Marduk. Such formulas introduced accounts of building projects whose religious purposes the text stressed over any political or military achievement. The king presented himself as servant of the gods, his power derived from their favor and exercised in their service. Whether this emphasis reflected genuine devotion or calculated propaganda, or most likely some combination that the king himself did not distinguish, the consistency of the message shaped how Nebuchadnezzar wished posterity to remember him. The astronomical knowledge that Babylonian scholars had accumulated over centuries received royal support that enabled continued observation and refinement. The priests who watched the heavens from temple platforms, recording the movements of celestial bodies with precision that would not be matched elsewhere for millennia, served purposes both religious and practical. The omens that astronomical events portended guided royal decisions. The calendrical calculations that observations enabled ordered the festivals and agricultural activities upon which society depended. Nebuchadnezzar's patronage of these scholarly endeavors reflected understanding that knowledge itself was a resource whose cultivation strengthened the realm. The empire that this administration governed had achieved an equilibrium whose stability the final decade of the reign confirmed. The military challenges that had demanded so much attention in earlier years had been resolved. The Levant pacified, Egypt contained, the borders secured against threats that no longer materialized with the frequency that previous decades had known. The building projects that had transformed Babylon continued at reduced intensity, their maintenance requiring less than their creation had demanded. The trade that enriched the empire flowed through channels that established practice had made reliable. The aging king could survey accomplishments that exceeded what his father had achieved and what any successor would match. The palace gardens offered spaces for reflection that the demands of earlier years had seldom permitted. The king, who had spent decades campaigning and building, now walked paths whose plantings provided shade against the Mesopotamian sun. Their greenery, a reminder of the hanging gardens that legend would later celebrate whether or not they existed in the forms that Greek writers described. The city beyond the palace walls hummed with activity that royal vision had enabled. Merchants and craftsmen, priests and scribes, soldiers and laborers, all performing functions that the imperial system had organized and sustained. Babylon had become what Nebuchadnezzar had determined it would become, and the king, in his final years, could observe the achievement that his life's work represented. But mortality, which spares neither kings nor commoners, was making its claims felt. Nebuchadnezzar had reigned for over 4 decades, his tenure exceeding that of most Babylonian kings, his accomplishments surpassing what any of them had achieved. The question of what would follow, who would inherit the throne, whether the systems he had built would survive his passing, what legacy his reign would ultimately represent. These considerations occupied a mind that had spent decades focused on more immediate concerns. The king who had built Babylon now contemplated what Babylon would become when the builder was gone. The contemplation grew more urgent as the signs of age accumulated. Nebuchadnezzar had ruled for 43 years, had transformed a recovering city into the wonder of the ancient world, had extended Babylonian power to limits that geography and rival kingdoms defined. The body that had led armies across deserts and supervised construction projects spanning decades now moved more slowly through the palace corridors, its vitality diminished by time that neither power nor piety could arrest. The king, who had built so much for posterity, now faced the reality that he himself would soon become part of the past he had labored to shape. The final years brought continued attention to projects whose completion or refinement occupied energies that campaigning no longer demanded. Canals whose maintenance sustained the agriculture upon which Babylon's population depended received repairs that ensured their function would continue beyond the reign that had improved them. Temple restorations that earlier decades had begun reached conclusions whose dedication ceremonies the aging king attended, his presence connecting divine worship to royal patronage one final time. The walls whose construction had consumed years of labor and countless bricks stood complete, their circuits enclosing a city whose defense the king had guaranteed against threats that his reign had kept at bay. Nebuchadnezzar spent hours reviewing the inscriptions that preserved his achievements in forms intended to outlast the perishable flesh that had accomplished them. The foundation deposits buried beneath temples, the commemorative tablets installed in sacred precincts, the rock-cut texts carved into Lebanese mountainsides. All these spoke to futures the king would not witness, their words announcing his deeds to generations yet unborn. The formulaic language of royal inscriptions, which later readers might find repetitive, carried for Nebuchadnezzar the weight of legacy deliberately constructed. Each text that proclaimed his piety, his building, his service to Marduk represented a small victory over the oblivion that time imposed on mortal accomplishment. The relationship with his heirs remained complex in ways that the sources illuminate only partially. Amel-Marduk, the son who would succeed him, appears in no significant records from his father's reign, his position as crown prince established, but his role in governance unclear. The silence might reflect simply the conventions of royal documentation, which centered attention on the reigning king rather than those who awaited succession. Or it might suggest tensions whose nature the surviving evidence does not preserve. What is certain is that Nebuchadnezzar made no apparent effort to associate his heir with his achievements. the inscriptions that celebrated royal accomplishments, naming only the king himself, never the son who would inherit what those accomplishments had created. Later tradition, preserved in the biblical book of Daniel, would attribute to Nebuchadnezzar a period of madness during which the great king lost his reason and lived like a beast in the fields, his hair growing like eagle's feathers and his nails like birds' claws. For 7 years, according to this account, the king who had built Babylon wandered in animal degradation until divine mercy restored his sanity and his throne. Whether this tradition preserved memory of actual mental affliction, perhaps episodes of illness that court records did not acknowledge, or represented theological interpretation that later communities imposed upon a ruler whose destruction of Jerusalem demanded explanation, scholarship cannot determine. The story became part of how subsequent ages remembered Nebuchadnezzar, the mighty king humbled by the god whose temple he had destroyed. His pride punished before his restoration demonstrated divine sovereignty over even the greatest of earthly powers. What the contemporary sources do preserve is a reign that continued functioning effectively until its end. The administrative systems that Nebuchadnezzar had built, maintaining their operations without the disruptions that royal incapacity would have produced. The empire collected its tributes, the temples performed their rituals, the merchants conducted their trade, the scribes recorded their observations. All the activities that constituted the life of Babylonian civilization proceeded with regularity that suggested governance whose direction remained steady. If madness afflicted the king, it left no trace in records, whose attention to administrative detail would likely have registered significant dysfunction. The death of Nebuchadnezzar came in October of 562 BC. The precise circumstances unrecorded beyond the simple fact that the king who had reigned since 605 BC reigned no more. 43 years of rule ended in the palace he had built, surrounded by the city he had transformed, leaving behind an empire whose extent and magnificence no Babylonian king had matched. The priests whose temples he had restored performed the rituals that royal death required, the ceremonies honoring a monarch whose patronage they had enjoyed for more than 4 decades. The body that had commanded armies and supervised constructions received whatever treatment Babylonian practice prescribed, its mortality now undeniable, regardless of the immortality that inscriptions and monuments sought to provide. Amel-Marduk ascended the throne his father had occupied for so long, inheriting responsibilities whose scope the decades of Nebuchadnezzar's reign had expanded, and whose management the systems his father built had routinized. The new king's reign would prove brief, barely 2 years before assassination ended it, and his achievements would pale against those of his predecessor. One act that later tradition remembered was his release of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar had deported decades earlier, and who had remained a captive in Babylon ever since. The gesture of mercy or political calculation freed an aging exile whose kingdom no longer existed, whose restoration posed no threat, whose captivity had outlasted the captor who had imposed it. The transition from Nebuchadnezzar to his successors marked not merely the end of a reign, but the beginning of a decline whose pace would prove swifter than anyone witnessing the great king's death could have anticipated. The empire that seemed so solid, the city that seemed so permanent, the dynasty that seemed so established, all these would prove more fragile than the bricks stamped with Nebuchadnezzar's name, which would outlast by millennia the political structures those bricks had built. The king who had accomplished so much could not accomplish the one thing that might have preserved his achievements indefinitely: He could not ensure that his successors would possess the capabilities his reign had required. But such knowledge lay in the future, invisible to those who mourned the great king's passing, and uncertain even in retrospect about the causes that would produce the collapse that followed. What those who witnessed the death of Nebuchadnezzar could see was the city that surrounded them, the walls and gates, the temples and palaces, the processional ways and sacred precincts that one king's vision had created from the accumulated resources of an empire. The builder was gone, but the buildings remained, their presence testifying to what had been achieved even as their future remained, like all futures, unknown. The future that unfolded proved less kind to Nebuchadnezzar's empire than the decades of his reign had been. Amel-Marduk's brief tenure ended in 560 BC, when Neriglissar, a general who had married into the royal family, orchestrated the assassination that removed him from a throne he had barely warmed. Neriglissar himself reigned only 4 years before death claimed him, leaving a son named Labashi-Marduk, whose youth and weakness invited the conspiracy that removed him after mere months. Nabonidus, the nobleman who emerged from this chaos to claim the crown in 556 BC, would prove the last king of the dynasty that Nabopolassar had founded and Nebuchadnezzar had glorified. The instability that followed Nebuchadnezzar's death, 4 kings in 6 years, 3 of them removed by violence, revealed how much the empire's strength had depended on the extraordinary capabilities of one man. The systems he had built continued functioning, the bureaucracy processing its documents, the temples performing their rituals, the merchants conducting their trade. But the leadership that had directed these systems toward coherent purpose was gone, replaced by figures whose brief tenures prevented the sustained attention that effective governance required. The empire that had seemed so formidable began showing weaknesses that rivals would eventually exploit. Nabonidus, the final king, proved an enigmatic figure whose interests diverged from the expectations that Babylonian tradition imposed on its rulers. His devotion to the moon, god's Sin, rather than to Marduk, alienated the powerful priesthood of Esagila, whose support previous kings had cultivated carefully. His prolonged absence from Babylon, a decade spent at the Arabian oasis of Tamar, for reasons that sources explain variously, left the capital without the royal presence that festivals and governance required. His son Belshazzar administered affairs in his absence, but a regent could not substitute for the king, whose participation Babylonian religion demanded. The New Year festival, whose proper celebration renewed the cosmic order, could not proceed without the king to clasp Marduk's hands, and for 10 years it did not proceed. The power that would bring this troubled dynasty to its end was rising in the east. Cyrus, king of Persia, had united the Iranian peoples under his rule and absorbed the Median kingdom that had once been Babylon's ally against Assyria. The alliance that Nebuchadnezzar's marriage to Amytis had symbolized was now irrelevant. The Medes themselves subjects of a Persian king whose ambitions encompassed everything that lay within his reach. Cyrus turned toward Babylon in 539 BC, his armies advancing against a kingdom whose internal divisions had prepared the way for external conquest. The fall came with a swiftness that the city's mighty walls might have seemed to preclude. The Persian forces entered Babylon in October of 539 BC, their arrival described in Cyrus's own inscriptions as a liberation welcomed by a population weary of Nabonidus's neglect. Whether this account reflected reality or merely the propaganda of the victor, the result was undeniable. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, barely 23 years after Nebuchadnezzar's death, had ceased to exist. The city that the great king had built to last forever became a provincial capital of a Persian empire whose center lay far to the east. Yet Babylon endured, even as independent sovereignty ended. Cyrus and his successors recognized the city's importance and maintained its temples, its administration, its role as a commercial and cultural center whose significance transcended political arrangements. The walls that Nebuchadnezzar had raised still stood. The Ishtar Gate still gleamed with its glazed blue bricks. The processional way still provided the route for festivals that Persian tolerance permitted to continue. The great ziggurat of Etemenanki still dominated the skyline, its profile visible for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain. Babylon remained a wonder of the world, even if the world it adorned was no longer ruled by Babylonian kings. The centuries that followed brought changes whose cumulative effect transformed the city from living metropolis to historical memory. Alexander the Great, who conquered the Persian Empire in the 4th century BC, made Babylon one of his capitals and reportedly planned restorations of Etemenanki that his early death prevented. The successors who divided his empire neglected the city in favor of new foundations, and gradual decline reduced what had been the ancient world's greatest city to a shadow of its former magnificence. The population dwindled, the buildings crumbled, the canals that had sustained agriculture silted up, and eventually even the location of Babylon became uncertain. Its ruins buried beneath accumulated debris that later generations would mistake for natural hills. But memory preserved what physical presence could not. The Jewish community, whose exile Nebuchadnezzar had imposed, carried stories of Babylon to wherever their dispersion took them, their scriptures recording the king who had destroyed Solomon's temple and carried Judah into captivity. The Book of Daniel portrayed him as a powerful but ultimately humbled ruler, his pride punished by divine intervention that reduced him to bestial madness before restoration, demonstrated the sovereignty of the God whose temple he had destroyed. These traditions ensured that Nebuchadnezzar's name would remain familiar long after other ancient kings had been forgotten. His role in sacred history preserving a prominence that secular achievements alone might not have sustained. Greek and Roman writers added their own accounts, some based on earlier sources whose reliability varied, others embellishing what imagination suggested about a city whose wonders had become legendary. The hanging gardens that later tradition counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world became inseparable from Nebuchadnezzar's name. The story of the king who built paradise for his homesick queen, capturing imaginations that more prosaic achievements might not have stirred. Whether the gardens existed as described, whether they existed at all, mattered less than the legend itself, which testified to a reputation for magnificence that centuries of transmission had not diminished. The rediscovery of Babylon began in the 19th century, when European archaeologists turned their attention to the mounds that local tradition identified as the remains of the ancient city. Robert Koldewey, the German archaeologist who excavated the site from 1899 to 1917, uncovered the physical evidence that confirmed and complicated the literary traditions. The Ishtar Gate emerged from the earth, its glazed bricks still bearing the colors that Nebuchadnezzar's craftsmen had created 25 centuries earlier. The processional way revealed its paving stones, their inscriptions still legible, still announcing the king who had laid them for Marduk, his lord. The reconstruction of the Ishtar Gate that Koldewey's excavations made possible now stands in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, its blue-glazed bricks and striding animals offering visitors a glimpse of the magnificence that ancient travelers had witnessed. The lions and dragons that process across its surface demonstrate the artistic sophistication that Nebuchadnezzar's reign had commanded. their forms preserved through catastrophes that destroyed the city they once adorned. Other museums around the world hold fragments, bricks stamped with the royal name, cylinder seals bearing royal images, tablets recording royal deeds, the scattered remnants of an empire reassembled in institutions dedicated to preserving what time had dispersed. The bricks themselves, those millions of individual units stamped with formulas announcing Nebuchadnezzar's identity, have proven the most enduring witness to his reign. Excavators found them everywhere the king had built, their inscriptions surviving when grander monuments had fallen. "I am Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon," the stamps declare. The message repeated across quantities that suggest the scale of construction that the king had undertaken. These humble objects, mass-produced by workers who could not have imagined the distant futures in which their products would be treasured, carry the king's name into a present he could not have conceived. The ruins of Babylon lie today in modern Iraq, their extent still impressive even after millennia of decay, and the depredations of later builders who quarried ancient bricks for their own constructions. The outline of walls can still be traced, the locations of gates identified, the foundations of palaces and temples mapped by archaeologists whose work continues to reveal what remains hidden. Visitors who stand amid these ruins stand where Nebuchadnezzar once walked, their presence connecting the present to a past whose distance is measured not merely in years, but in the transformations that separate the ancient world from everything that followed. The king who built this city built more than walls and gates and temples. He built a symbol whose power transcended the political arrangements that created it, a name that would echo through traditions sacred and secular, a legacy that time diminished but could not erase. Nebuchadnezzar dreamed of permanence and achieved it, though not quite in the forms he had intended, not through an empire that endured, but through a reputation that outlasted empire, not through buildings that survived intact, but through ruins that inspired wonder and fragments that found their way to museums, not through dynasty that continued, but through a name that even those who know nothing else of ancient Babylon recognize. The moonlight that falls on those ruins tonight falls on stones that Nebuchadnezzar's workers laid, on foundations that Nebuchadnezzar's architects designed, on a landscape that Nebuchadnezzar's vision transformed. The wind that moves across the site carries no sound of the processions that once filled the sacred way, no echo of the prayers that once rose from a sagala, no murmur of the commerce that once animated streets now silent. But the silence itself testifies to what once was, a city of wonder, a king of ambition, an achievement that time has veiled but not erased. In the quiet of the ruins, the memory of Babylon endures, and with it, the memory of the king who made Babylon what the world would never forget.